Hey, I'm Timothy, and in today's video, we're exploring the deadliest food challenges ever attempted. From a woman who agreed to take part in a popular spicy food challenge, expecting nothing worse than a burning mouth, to a man whose attempt to swallow a 4-foot noodle ended somewhere no one could reach.
It was July 19, 2015. Late afternoon heat settled over a backyard pool in Kendall, Miami, with humidity hovering near 80% and temperatures around 92 degrees Fahrenheit. The concrete deck was hot to the touch, music carried across trimmed lawns, and the air smelled of chlorine and sunscreen. Brandon Hale was 22 and entering his senior year at a local university. He studied communications and maintained active social media accounts built around pool parties, small pranks, and escalating dares. Friends described him as competitive and focused on how events would look on camera. He had grown up in Broward County and often spoke about producing a clip that would spread beyond his immediate circle. That Sunday gathering was informal. A friend brought a large watermelon purchased earlier in the week. It had been left near the grill since noon, exposed to direct sunlight for several hours in temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. By late afternoon, the rind felt warm and dry. Prolonged sun exposure would not harden the rind, but it could warm the fruit and dry the outer surface. The rind of a watermelon is naturally thick and firm, often requiring a knife to cut. Online videos earlier that summer showed people attempting to break watermelons with their foreheads. Brandon said the stunt was harmless. He placed the melon on a lightweight plastic patio table near the shallow end of the pool. A phone was propped against a cooler to record. At approximately 5:30 p.m., several guests gathered nearby. Brandon wiped sweat from his face and leaned forward. He stepped back about a foot, then moved toward the table and struck the watermelon with his forehead. The first impact produced a dull thud. The fruit did not split. Witnesses later told investigators they heard a cracking sound, likely from the rind. Brandon immediately struck it a second time. Instead of shattering, the watermelon absorbed some force but remained largely intact. The table shifted slightly on the concrete. During the second impact, his forehead made direct contact with the firm rind, while his neck was flexed forward, increasing the force transmitted to the skull. A sharper sound followed. The melon partially split, but Brandon did not regain balance. He fell forward and then sideways, striking the right side of his head against the concrete deck. Guests initially assumed he was joking. Within seconds, they noticed he was unresponsive. A friend rolled him onto his back. His eyes were open but not tracking. There was visible swelling on his forehead and bleeding from a scalp laceration, likely caused by either the rind or the fall onto concrete. Someone called 911 at 5:32 p.m. Paramedics arrived within approximately 8 minutes. They found him unconscious with irregular breathing and a weak pulse. He was immobilized, given oxygen, and transported to a nearby trauma center. CT imaging showed a depressed frontal skull fracture with associated bleeding inside the skull, including subdural hemorrhage. Swelling placed pressure on the brain. Emergency surgery was performed to relieve intracranial pressure and remove bone fragments. Despite intervention, neurological function did not return. He was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as blunt force head trauma with traumatic brain injury. The injury pattern was consistent with high-force impact against a firm object, followed by secondary impact with concrete. The watermelon did not explode. It provided resistance, allowing force to transfer directly to the skull. The recording circulated briefly before being removed at his family's request. The university later issued a safety advisory discouraging dangerous stunt challenges at student events. The incident was classified as an accidental death resulting from blunt head trauma sustained during a recreational activity. It was September 4, 2022 in Columbus, Ohio. The apartment was small and the kitchen opened directly into the living room. The stove sat against the far wall, close enough to the couch that you could smell whatever was cooking from anywhere in the space. Kayla Morris was 24. She worked the morning shift as a dental receptionist downtown, a job she had held for 2 years and was known to be reliable at. Most evenings, she came home with enough energy left to cook, to scroll, and sometimes to film short videos on her phone. She had recently started posting online, nothing with a large following yet, but she was consistent, and she paid attention to what worked. Those who knew her said she was the kind of person who committed fully once she decided on something. She did not do things halfway. Earlier that year, a video had begun circulating online that showed someone cooking a chicken breast in a pan filled with bright green NyQuil. The medicine was a common over-the-counter nighttime cold remedy. The video was framed as a recipe. It had a thumbnail. It had a title. The presentation carried the same casual domestic tone as any ordinary cooking video, the kind that made the process look simple and the result look worth trying. Kayla watched it late one evening while scrolling through her phone. The video was short and cut quickly between steps. No one explained the chemistry of what was happening in the pan. The comments underneath treated it like a joke or a challenge. She watched the video twice, then she thought about how she would film her own version. The next day, after work, she stopped at a store and bought a package of chicken breasts and a bottle of NyQuil. That evening, she cleared space on the counter and propped her phone upright against a glass so the camera faced the stove. She opened the recording app and tested the angle, stepping briefly into frame before returning behind the counter. When everything looked right, she pressed record. She placed a pan on the stove and poured the bright green liquid in. The color spread across the metal surface in a thin layer. She turned the burner on and waited. NyQuil contains several active compounds that are safe when taken as directed in measured liquid doses. Heating medications, however, can change how those ingredients behave. Some compounds may release vapors when heated, meaning they can be inhaled rather than processed slowly through the stomach. Kayla stood over the stove as the liquid began to simmer. The vapor rose slowly at first, thin and barely visible. As the heat increased, the smell spread through the small apartment. She leaned in slightly to check the pan. A few seconds passed. She coughed once, then again, sharper this time. She straightened and stepped back from the stove, blinking as her eyes watered. She reached for the counter to steady herself. Her legs did not hold. She collapsed, striking her head on the floor as she went down. A neighbor in the next apartment heard the impact through the wall and came to knock on the door. When there was no response, they called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and forced entry into the apartment. The stove burner was still on and the pan continued to heat. One paramedic moved to turn off the burner while another knelt beside Kayla to check her breathing and pulse. She was placed on a stretcher and transported by ambulance to the nearest hospital. Kayla Morris was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later determined that she had suffered a fatal head injury when she struck the floor after collapsing beside the stove. The video was never posted. It was August 3rd, 2015. At the Tulsa County Fairgrounds in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The booth sat near the food row, surrounded by fried snacks, music, and the kind of noise that makes bad ideas feel harmless. From a distance, it looked like one more county fair stunt. Up close, the setup was already unstable. At the center of it was Greg "Gully" Hansen, 34, a laid-off warehouse worker who had turned local eating contests into steady money. He was not some national star. He bounced between moving jobs, cleanup work, and weekend challenges, using prize cash to help cover rent and keep his younger brother and sister afloat while they finished school. That part matters because this was not ego alone. It was pressure wearing the mask of confidence, and that confidence had a flaw. Greg had built a name on dry challenges, the kind where the food fought back even before it reached your stomach. People around Tulsa knew him as calm under pressure, but also as someone who kept raising the bar once crowds expected it. At first it was smaller portions, then faster times, then stricter rules. Each step felt manageable, and that's how it built. Slow enough that nobody treated it like a real risk anymore. The booth itself was basic. Folding tables, plastic tubs, a timer, paper signage, and a narrow fenced lane to keep the crowd back. The challenge was simple on paper. Eat roughly 7 pounds of dehydrated potato flakes in a few minutes without liquid. That sounds stupid, and honestly, it was. But the real problem was how the food behaved. Dry flakes do not stay dry once they hit moisture. They swell, thicken, and turn into a dense mass that is much harder to move back up than people think. And somehow, at a county fair, that passed as a good idea. Greg had practiced with smaller amounts, enough to understand the discomfort, but not enough to recreate the full danger. That day, the serving tubs were packed tighter than usual, and witnesses later said that texture looked finer than the batches he had used before. That meant faster absorption, faster expansion. A small change, but it pushed everything closer to the limit without anyone adjusting for it. I've seen people point this out in the comments before, and it makes more sense here. It's not just about doing something hard, it's about pushing a little further each time, until those small changes stop feeling like risk. He started strong. He kept his head down, packed each handful efficiently, and barely wasted motion. The first minute looked controlled. The second looked strained. By the final stretch, his pace was still fast, but his breathing had changed. Shorter, heavier, forced through his mouth. The crowd counted him down, and when he finished inside the limit, people cheered like they had just watched something impressive instead of something already going wrong. And that's the part that throws people off, because once the timer ends, everyone assumes the risk is over. Then came the release. Greg stepped back, shoulders rising hard, chest working to pull in air. Someone handed him water, and he drank quickly, more than he had taken in during the challenge. And this is where everything turns, because the dry mass inside him finally had what it needed to expand. At first, the change was subtle. He paced once, then twice, one hand pressing below his ribs. Then his posture tightened, his steps slowed. The discomfort didn't stay in one place. It moved upward. Within another minute, he bent forward and tried to vomit, but almost nothing came up. He wasn't coughing or calling out, just forcing air through his mouth in short, strained breaths. The mixture had already thickened too much. A vendor noticed the swelling before anyone else reacted. Greg's shirt stretched slightly at the front. His breathing turned shallow and fast. He tried to straighten up, then couldn't. His balance shifted, and he staggered toward the back of the booth. That's when people started to realize this wasn't part of the act. Someone yelled for help. EMTs were called, but even with a quick response, those minutes were doing all the damage. The pressure inside his abdomen was pushing upward into his diaphragm, reducing how much his lungs could expand. At the same time, his stomach was stretching past its limit, creating internal stress his body couldn't relieve. The medical findings were blunt. Greg died after the thickened potato mixture obstructed his airway during repeated attempts to vomit, leading to rapid respiratory failure. The mixture had become too dense to expel, and portions of it moved upward into his airway as pressure increased. Investigators found no poisoning, no trauma, and no foul play. Greg's death was ruled accidental, caused by the rapid expansion of the potato mixture after the challenge. It was May 26, 2018 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The cookout sat behind a single-story house, quiet and ordinary, with folding chairs scattered across the yard and a small grill running steadily near the patio. Nothing about the setup suggested risk. If anything, it felt like the kind of evening where the only thing people might complain about was overcooked food or running out of buns. Earlier that day, Melissa Hanley, 39, spent the afternoon running errands and doing things around the house. She hadn't eaten much by the time she arrived at the cookout and went straight toward the food when it was served. The cookout had turned into more than just food. One group had started a simple eating challenge, and another table was setting up a second round that Melissa also wanted to join. Not wanting to miss it, she treated the first round like something to finish quickly instead of something to enjoy. When the food came off the grill, she went straight for it. One hot dog turned into more. She doubled the meat, added bacon, then took another and squeezed it onto her plate. People pointed it out, but she laughed it off, stayed standing, and took large bites so she could finish faster. It looked harmless, but rushing it like that quietly made things risky. Hot dogs are soft, but when packed tightly into a bun with added meat and toppings, they lose that softness. The bite she took was larger than it looked, compressed into a dense mass that didn't break apart and not fully chewed before she tried to swallow. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. She paused briefly as if something hadn't gone down cleanly, then took a drink to push it through. That's when it shifted. Instead of clearing, the food lodged deeper. The obstruction lodged firmly in her airway, restricting airflow. She coughed once, then again, sharper this time. People nearby assumed she had just swallowed wrong, the kind of minor choking everyone recovers from in a few seconds. But she didn't. She tried to take another sip of her drink, tilting her head back, but the liquid didn't clear it and disrupted her ability to cough effectively. The coughing became more forceful, but less effective, her breaths shortening as airflow became restricted. Within seconds, the sound changed, from coughing to something quieter, strained, almost silent. That's the part people missed, because it didn't look dramatic. There was no immediate collapse, No obvious panic at first. She stayed upright, one hand on the table, trying to clear it herself. By the time others realized something was wrong, her airway was already significantly blocked. Someone stepped in and asked if she was choking. She couldn't answer. They attempted to help, but there was hesitation, uncertainty about what to do, whether to intervene, whether it would resolve on its own. Those seconds stretched. When they finally tried abdominal thrusts, the obstruction didn't dislodge. By the time abdominal thrusts were attempted, the obstruction didn't dislodge. Witnesses called emergency services immediately. However, within the next few minutes, she became unresponsive before EMS arrived. They continued airway management and resuscitation efforts on scene before transporting her, but the lack of oxygen had already caused severe damage. At the hospital, attempts to restore breathing were unsuccessful. The cause of death was ruled as airway obstruction due to choking. It was August 9, 2017, in rural Nevada. The roadside diner on Route 93 was quiet at that hour, the way it always was before the trucks started pulling in from the highway. The desert outside was still dark, and the kitchen lights were the only thing burning on that stretch of road. In a few hours, the place would be full of truckers and travelers passing through. Linda Marsh, 63, had worked as the cook at the diner for 9 years. Before that, she had worked in a school cafeteria for 11 years, and before that, she had cooked at a roadside restaurant 2 towns over that closed when the owner retired. Cooking in commercial kitchens was all she had done for most of her adult life, and she was good at it. She arrived at 5:30 every morning to begin prep before the 6 o'clock opening. She worked the breakfast shift alone, and had done so long enough that the routine ran entirely on muscle memory. Same sequence every morning. See, I have researched a lot of food-related deaths, and this one sits differently from most of them, because this was not something she ate by choice. This was her job. The diner used a commercial powdered egg mix stored in a large white container behind the prep counter, delivered every 2 weeks. 2 days before the incident, that delivery arrived alongside a bulk order of industrial degreaser, packaged in nearly identical containers. Both were unloaded and placed on the same shelf without separation. One held the egg mix, the other held sodium metasilicate, an alkaline degreaser used to clean kitchen surfaces. Both containers were white, similar in size and shape, with printed labels that were not checked after shelving. This is the part that is genuinely unsettling to me. Both containers were white, same shelf, same size. The only thing that changed was which one she reached for. On the morning of August 9th, she arrived at 5:30, unlocked the back door, turned on the kitchen lights, and began her prep sequence the way she always did. She reached behind the counter for the egg mix container and opened it. The powder inside caught her attention for a moment. It looked slightly different from what she was used to, a little finer in texture, a slightly different shade of white. She stood there for a moment and looked at it. She had seen variation between batches before. Suppliers changed formulations sometimes, and the product did not always look identical from one order to the next. She had never had a batch turn out to be anything other than what it was supposed to be. She tipped the powder into the mixing bowl, added water, and placed it on the heat. What gets me about that moment is that she saw it. She paused. Something in her registered that this was wrong, and then 9 years of routine told her to keep going. A few minutes into the preparation, she tasted a small portion from the spoon, the way she always did partway through cooking. The taste was immediate and completely wrong, harsh and soapy and chemical in a way that had nothing to do with eggs or food of any kind. She pulled the spoon away from her mouth and stood still. For a moment, she tried to work out what could have caused it. The idea that she had reached for the wrong container did not occur to her. That container had always been the egg mix. It had been in the same spot on the same shelf for as long as she had worked there. She rinsed her mouth, looked at the bowl, and assumed something had contaminated the mix. Maybe the bowl hadn't been rinsed properly from the night before. So she kept going. She rinsed her mouth and kept cooking. That detail alone kept me up when I first read this case. Within minutes, Linda felt a burning sensation begin in her mouth and throat that was nothing like the discomfort of eating something too hot. It spread downward into her chest and stomach rapidly. Then she went down on the kitchen floor before anyone could reach her. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and Linda was transported to a regional hospital where she was admitted to intensive care. Doctors identified severe chemical burns to her esophagus and stomach consistent with ingestion of a caustic alkaline substance. Investigators later confirmed that she had used sodium metasilicate, an industrial degreaser stored alongside the egg mix following a delivery 2 days earlier. Both containers were labeled, but the difference was not recognized during use. Linda died 2 days later from complications related to internal hemorrhaging. Following the incident, local health authorities cited the diner for improper storage of hazardous chemicals and required corrective measures, including strict separation of cleaning agents and food supplies, revised labeling protocols, and staff safety retraining. Linda Marsh spent over 30 years cooking food for other people. She died because 2 containers ended up on the same shelf. That is the whole story, and that is exactly what makes it so dark. It was August 3rd, 2016, in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Miami, Florida. The morning air was thick with humidity after an overnight thunderstorm had passed through the area, leaving scattered debris and fallen branches across the subdivision. Marlon Jace, a 48-year-old warehouse supervisor, lived in a modest single-story home surrounded by dense tropical vegetation on the edge of the neighborhood. He had moved there nearly 8 years earlier and had slowly turned the backyard into something he took quiet pride in maintaining. Along the fence line stood mango trees, hibiscus shrubs, and one large ackee tree that had already been there when he bought the house. The tree towered nearly 30 feet above the yard, its thick canopy spreading wide enough to shade much of the lawn. Over the years, neighbors occasionally mentioned that the fruit it produced was used in Caribbean cooking. Marlon had never paid much attention to it. The tree simply dropped its bright red pods into the grass every so often, and he usually left them alone. The overnight storm had changed that. Strong winds had shaken the branches, scattering several of the red pods across the yard. As Marlon walked outside that morning to check the damage from the storm, he noticed the fallen fruit lying in the wet grass. He gathered a few of the pods and carried them inside, remembering that ackee was sometimes cooked with eggs in Caribbean dishes. In his kitchen, Marlon cut open the pods and removed the pale yellow flesh inside. After discarding the large black seeds, he rinsed the pieces under running water, preparing them as he would any other fruit before cooking. He cooked the pale yellow arils in a frying pan with eggs and onions, preparing a simple meal similar to dishes commonly made with ackee. After finishing the meal at his kitchen table, the evening passed quietly. Several hours later, Marlon began experiencing a sudden wave of nausea. What initially seemed minor quickly intensified. The nausea soon turned into repeated bouts of vomiting. As the night went on, the episodes continued and left him increasingly weak. His movements became unsteady as the illness progressed. By early morning, the worsening symptoms overwhelmed him. Marlon collapsed onto the kitchen floor. The next day, a neighbor noticed that Marlon's front door had been left partially open since the night before. When he also failed to leave for work and his truck remained parked in the driveway, well past his usual departure time, the neighbor walked over to check on him. Emergency responders were contacted immediately and arrived to find Marlon unresponsive on his kitchen floor. They transported him to a local medical facility while attempting stabilization procedures, but his condition continued to deteriorate during transport. Despite medical intervention, Marlon was pronounced dead that evening from complications related to severe hypoglycemia. The medical examination revealed the presence of hypoglycin toxin in his system, consistent with consumption of unripe ackee fruit. Hypoglycin interferes with the body's ability to produce glucose, causing blood sugar levels to drop to dangerously low levels. Investigators found several unopened ackee pods on his kitchen counter, confirming the source of the poisoning. The official report determined that the death resulted from accidental ingestion of improperly prepared ackee fruit, confirming that the pods had been harvested before they had opened naturally on the tree. In the weeks that followed, the ackee tree in Marlon's backyard was removed by the property's next occupants.
It was February 17th, 2018. Savannah, Georgia in mid-February is that in-between kind of weather. Mild enough during the day, cooling down into the low 50s degrees Fahrenheit at night, the kind of conditions where people actually feel like going out. Willa Sombert was 71, born and raised in Savannah, spent 34 years teaching middle school English, and had been living alone in the same house since her husband passed a few years back. Sharp, independent, mild hypertension managed with medication. Nothing that would make anyone worry about her. That evening, her daughter and son-in-law took her out to a riverfront restaurant she'd always liked, just a quiet birthday dinner. She ordered the pan-seared flounder, something she'd had there before. Her daughter had been trying to get her out to that restaurant for weeks, and she'd kept putting it off the way she always did, saying it was too much trouble, that they didn't need to make a big deal out of it. That evening, she finally agreed. They had a good meal, talked, and her family dropped her home around 9 p.m. Nobody left that table with anything to worry about. The only thing she noticed, and barely registered, was a faint scratching sensation in her throat toward the end of the meal. She didn't mention it. It was her birthday. The evening had been good, and it felt like nothing worth bringing up. By the morning of February 18th, Willa had a dull ache behind her sternum that she treated with antacids. It eased slightly, which only confirmed in her mind it was reflux. She called her daughter, said she felt a bit off, probably just needed rest. By February 19th, the discomfort had worsened, and she'd developed a low-grade fever around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She figured a cold was coming on and stayed home. And honestly, who wouldn't do the same? Every symptom she had at that point had a completely routine explanation. By the evening the next day, the fever had pushed past 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The chest pain had gotten bad enough that taking a full breath hurt, and she was having difficulty swallowing even water. She called her daughter just before midnight. Here's what had actually been happening inside her chest over those 3 days. The mediastinum, the enclosed space in the center of the chest between the two lungs, had been filling with infection the entire time she was home, treating what she thought was a cold. It's one of the worst places in the body for that to happen, spreading fast through a confined space that sits right up against structures you cannot afford to lose. By the time she made that call, it had likely been going on for close to 2 days already. Given her age and how far the infection had progressed, surgery carried more risk than benefit. Aggressive antibiotic treatment was started immediately, but her condition kept declining through February 21st. The infection spreading faster than treatment could contain it. Septic shock set in as her cardiovascular system lost the ability to keep up. Sadly, Willa died on February 22nd, 5 days after her birthday dinner. Post-mortem confirmed septic shock secondary to mediastinitis from esophageal perforation. A fishbone fragment measuring approximately 14 millimeters was recovered from the perforation site. Contributing factors included her age, the thinning of esophageal tissue, and the delay in seeking care. The restaurant was reviewed and came back clean. The bone was a naturally occurring fragment in the fillet, undetected during preparation. The case was ruled accidental. It was October 14, 2015, outside Amarillo, Texas. Temperatures had dropped overnight, and truck traffic moved steadily through the highway stop as drivers came in for coffee, fuel, and quick food before getting back on the road. Inside the store, Roller Grill hot dogs had been sitting under warming lamps through most of the night. Justine Bell was 46 and worked overnight dispatch for a small freight company in Amarillo, spending most nights alone in front of radio chatter and delivery schedules while tracking drivers across West Texas. After his divorce in 2013, he started taking every overnight shift he could because the extra money helped cover bills. The overnight shift meant sitting alone in a dim office from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., mostly surviving on caffeine and gas station food. And a lot of people working nights probably know that routine pretty well. Around 1:30 almost every morning, Justine stopped at the same exit and grabbed 2 Roller Grill hot dogs covered in chili and cheese. He's a regular that the staff could recognize his truck before he even walked inside. What nobody knew was that the grill's heating element had been malfunctioning for nearly a week. The screen still displayed safe temperatures, but maintenance logs later showed the rollers repeatedly dropped below 140 degrees overnight. That temperature range is ideal for Listeria monocytogenes to grow, especially in food sitting there for hours. 2 days later, Justine called in sick for the first time in 8 months. Co-workers assumed he had finally burned himself out because he was sleeping less than 5 hours a day most weeks. But by the following night, He was calling dispatch confused and asking coworkers to repeat route information he had known for years. And I believe that's probably when the people around him realized something was seriously wrong. Because according to other drivers, Justine was usually the kind of person who never forgot anything. That same night, surveillance footage showed him stumbling out of the gas station bathroom and grabbing the doorframe to steady himself. Minutes earlier, he had vomited in the parking lot. The cashier later admitted she assumed he was drunk. At 2:40 a.m. on October 18th, Justine drove himself to the hospital complaining of a crushing headache, neck stiffness, and shaking he could not control. Doctors initially suspected a stroke or severe migraine. Within hours, his speech became slurred, his neck locked rigid, and he became combative during an MRI attempt. Staff had to restrain him. He was moved into intensive care later that morning. Over the next 18 hours, he suffered 6 seizures. Nurses described his body arching backward violently while blood vessels burst across his eyes from the pressure building inside his skull. A neurosurgeon eventually drilled a drainage port into his skull to relieve the swelling. Fluid drawn from around his spinal cord appeared cloudy instead of clear, a major sign of bacterial infection. Lab results confirmed listeria within 36 hours. Investigators later swabbed the Valero grill and found bacteria packed into grease and dried food residue beneath the rollers. Justine briefly stabilized on the morning of October 20th before suddenly crashing hours later. The swelling in his brain forced tissue downward through the base of the skull, shutting down the parts controlling breathing and heart rate. He was pronounced dead later that day. The autopsy confirmed fatal bacterial meningitis caused by listeria, with chronic sleep deprivation likely weakening his immune system beforehand. Health inspectors later removed the roller grill from the Valero after bacterial contamination was found beneath the heating elements. Justine's final debit card purchase was $2.14 for the same hot dog order he had bought almost every night for 2 years.
It was November 11th, 2018, in Mesa, Arizona. The kitchen was lit by one overhead bulb. A microwave, plate, bowl, and egg sat on the counter. Nothing looked dangerous, but the setup depended on a bad assumption. Like most evenings there, 17-year-old Evan Solis moved too fast. He was a high school senior who made cash fixing cracked phone screens, but his shortcut habit carried into ordinary tasks. He treated cooking the same way: fast, casual, incomplete. The kitchen system was simple, but it had one hidden risk. A microwave heats unevenly, and an egg sealed in its shell traps steam. The shell gives that pressure nowhere to escape, and the heat stays trapped until the egg fails all at once. This started with dinner. Evan wanted egg salad, but boiling water felt slow, so he put a whole egg in a bowl and microwaved it. I've seen shocking deaths start with harmless shortcuts, and this one fits. I've seen people do this exact thing, microwaving something sealed just to save time. It feels efficient, harmless even, right up until the moment it isn't. The cycle ended quietly, but that silence made the mistake look successful. There was no leaking shell, no smoke, no smell, and the danger stayed hidden. Most people would take that silence as proof that nothing was wrong. His cousin stood in the doorway, and no one saw a reason to step in. Evan opened the microwave, lifted the egg, and turned it in his fingers. His mother, in the next room, later said she heard him laugh. That's when it shifted. He brought the egg closer to inspect it, but the heat inside hadn't settled. The shell burst at close range with a sharp pop, and the superheated contents splashed across his face and mouth. He dropped what was left immediately, but the worst damage was already inside. The egg hit his lips and mouth, and the burns went deeper than they first appeared. His cousin later said he stumbled backward, grabbed his face, then his neck. He tried to cough, but the swelling in his airway had already started. The heat damaged the lining of his mouth and upper throat, and his breathing began to turn short and strained. Within the next few minutes, it worsened. He lost his balance near the refrigerator and collapsed. His cousin called 911, and paramedics arrived about 6 minutes later. By then, Evan was unresponsive. There were no signs of assault, poisoning, or any hidden cause, so responders treated it as a sudden thermal injury. At the hospital, doctors tried to secure his airway, but the swelling had narrowed it so badly that oxygen could barely move. The medical findings were clear. He died from airway obstruction caused by severe heat burns inside the mouth and throat. The shell itself wasn't what killed him. The superheated egg inside caused rapid swelling that closed his airway. Investigators found no foul play. Witness accounts, kitchen evidence, and the injury pattern all matched one sequence. The appliance worked as expected, but the pressure trapped inside the egg turned a simple shortcut into a fatal mistake. And honestly, this is what gets me, because after going through that egg case, I caught myself thinking, okay, that's just a weird one-off. But then you start seeing a pattern. It's always something small, something you've probably done yourself without thinking. It was October 4th, 2016 in Duluth, Minnesota. The woods behind the neighborhood were past their peak color, the leaves coming down in patches and the ground cover thick and damp from 2 days of rain. It was the kind of autumn morning that made foraging feel productive, the kind of conditions that bring mushrooms up in numbers. Carol Vess, 54, was a dental hygienist who had worked at a practice in Duluth for 16 years. She was methodical by nature, the kind of person who read the instructions fully before starting anything and kept notes on things she wanted to remember. Earlier that year, she had enrolled in an 8-hour community course on wild mushroom identification, completed it in full, and begun foraging on a small scale through the summer. She had successfully harvested chanterelles twice before and had eaten them without any issue. Those 2 successes had given her a working confidence in her ability to distinguish what was safe from what was not. And look, 2 successful harvests is not nothing. That is real experience. The problem with amatoxin poisoning is it only needs one opportunity. She had started foraging partly out of practical interest, and partly because the farmer's market in Duluth, where she usually bought mushrooms, had seen its supply thin out as the season wound down. Wild foraging extended the season. The course had given her a framework, and the chanterelles had given her proof that the framework worked. On the morning of October 4th, she spent approximately 2 hours walking the wooded land behind her neighborhood and returned with just over a pound of mushrooms she believed to be a young, unopened, puffball-like variety she had seen referenced in her course materials. Before she began preparing them, she photographed the mushrooms and posted the image to an online foraging forum she had joined during the summer. She asked if anyone could confirm the identification. She did not wait for a response before going into the kitchen. And this is the detail I kept going back to during research. She asked the right question. She just did not wait for the answer. When she cleaned them, she trimmed the stems, but did not excavate the base of the mushrooms, where a vulva, a sac-like structure characteristic of Amanita species, is often found. She also did not slice the mushrooms in half to confirm a uniform white interior, a standard step used to distinguish true puffballs from immature Amanita species. Both checks would have indicated she had the wrong mushroom. Neither was done. The mushrooms she had harvested were Amanita phalloides, commonly known as the death cap. They are responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide. At certain stages of growth, they bear a close visual resemblance to young puffball varieties, and the difference is not always obvious even to people with training. There is no reliable taste or smell that distinguishes Amanita phalloides from edible species. The toxin they contain, alpha-amanitin, works by disrupting the process cells used to produce proteins, targeting an enzyme called RNA polymerase II that is essential for normal cellular function. The damage it causes is not immediate, and it does not produce symptoms that would alert someone to what they have consumed. The body absorbs it quietly, and the destruction builds slowly over time, primarily targeting the liver and kidneys. And this is the part of amatoxin poisoning that I find most disturbing. There is no immediate reaction, nothing to tell you that something irreversible has already begun. Carol prepared a cream-based pasta dish using the mushrooms that evening and ate alone. The meal was unremarkable. Nothing about it tasted wrong or caused her any discomfort. That evening, she went about her normal routine and slept without any issue. Roughly 12 to 18 hours after the meal, she noticed mild abdominal discomfort and some nausea that came and went through the afternoon. The symptoms were not severe and were easy to attribute to something minor. By the second day, the nausea had worsened and she was experiencing intermittent cramping and vomiting. The symptoms then briefly improved before worsening again, which is a known feature of amatoxin poisoning. The brief improvement gives the impression that whatever caused the illness is passing, It is not passing. The toxin continues its work during that window regardless of how the patient feels. The thing that gets me about that false improvement is how cruel it is. For a few hours, she would have felt like she was getting better. She was not. She sought medical care and presented to the emergency department reporting symptoms consistent with a gastrointestinal illness. There was nothing in her initial presentation that immediately indicated toxin exposure. Blood tests revealed markedly elevated AST and ALT levels and impaired coagulation, findings that indicated serious injury to the liver. Doctors began investigating the cause and the connection to mushroom consumption was established. The findings were consistent with amatoxin poisoning. Treatment included supportive care and administration of therapies used in suspected amatoxin poisoning, though these are not always effective once significant liver injury has occurred. She was admitted to intensive care and evaluated for liver transplantation as her liver function continued to decline. A donor organ was not secured in time. Carol Vess died on October 12, 2016, 8 days after the meal. She was 54 years old. Cause of death was recorded as acute liver failure, resulting from amatoxin poisoning, following ingestion of Amanita phalloides. After her death, a review of her phone showed that responses had been posted to the foraging forum sometime after the meal had already been prepared and eaten. Several members had flagged the mushrooms in the photograph as a possible misidentification and urged her to confirm before consuming them. The warnings had arrived too late. She had not checked the forum again before sitting down to eat. This is the part of Carol Vess's story I can't get past. The warnings were already there on her phone. She just never read them. It was May 19, 2017, in Mobile, Alabama. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the waterfront district as a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water from the nearby harbor. The temperature had reached 78 degrees Fahrenheit, creating comfortable conditions for pedestrians walking along the marina boardwalk. Vinty Spoke, a 61-year-old retired marine mechanic, had developed a routine of taking morning walks along the harbor before stopping at a small waterfront diner for breakfast. His decades of working on boat engines had given him an appreciation for the maritime atmosphere. Vinty was known among the diner's regular customers as a friendly conversationalist who often shared stories about his years maintaining marine equipment. The diner occupied a converted warehouse building approximately 200 feet from the water's edge. Its interior featured weathered wooden tables and nautical decorations. The establishment specialized in fresh seafood caught by local fishing boats, with whole fried fish being one of their most popular menu items. That morning, Vinty entered the diner and took his usual seat at a small table near the front windows overlooking the marina. Two acquaintances who frequented the establishment were seated at a nearby table, and they exchanged casual greetings as Vinty reviewed the menu. He ordered a whole fried fish served in the traditional style with bones intact. The fish arrived within 15 minutes, prepared according to the restaurant's standard method. The species served contained numerous thin rib bones typical of local catch, requiring diners to carefully remove visible bones while eating. Vinty had consumed similar preparations countless times during his years living near the coast. As he ate, Vinty continued his conversation with the two men at the adjacent table, discussing recent changes to the harbor's commercial fishing operations. The casual atmosphere created a relaxed dining experience that encouraged unhurried consumption of the meal. At some point during the meal, a thin fish bone hidden within the meat was swallowed. The sharp bone lodged deep in his throat and shifted toward the entrance of his airway. The obstruction triggered violent coughing as swelling quickly developed in the surrounding tissue, restricting his airflow. Within minutes, Vinty began experiencing extreme difficulty breathing. He started coughing violently and clutching his throat while attempting to inhale. The two men at the nearby table immediately noticed his distress and called for assistance. Restaurant staff responded quickly to the emergency, calling for medical services while attempting to help. Witnesses reported that Vinty was struggling to breathe and unable to speak clearly as the obstruction and swelling worsened. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Vinty in critical condition with severe airway obstruction. They attempted airway clearing procedures and oxygen support while preparing him for rapid transport. He was transported to a regional medical facility, but died shortly after arrival, despite intensive medical intervention. Emergency physicians later identified the fish bone lodged deep within the upper airway, where it had caused critical obstruction and extensive airway swelling. The medical examiner later confirmed that the cause of death was accidental airway obstruction caused by an ingested fish bone.
It was March 7th, 2017. Portland, Oregon in early March is the kind of gray that just doesn't quit. Overcast for weeks straight. Damp cold that gets into the walls of older houses and stays there. The East Side neighborhoods are packed with craftsman bungalows full of working professionals who take their morning routines seriously. Dave Rick was 43. Project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm, the kind of guy who ran his life on a tight schedule. He worked out 3 times a week, watched what he ate, and made a smoothie every single morning. Same ingredients, same order, same wide-mouth glass jar blender he'd had for years. At some point in the weeks before March 7th, a hairline crack had developed along the base of that jar. Not something you'd catch unless you were holding it up to direct light and specifically looking for it. That morning, the vibration of the blade under load finished what the crack had started. A small section of the base fractured inward during blending. The contents absorbed it. Thick smoothie, frozen fruit, no visual separation, and he drank it fast before heading out, rinsed the jar, and left for work. The missing section at the base wasn't something he would have noticed on a quick rinse. The thing about someone like Dave is that he wasn't the type to slow down over something minor. He tracked his nutrition, stuck to his workout schedule, and ran his days on a tight enough routine that small disruptions just got absorbed and moved past. A vague sense that something was slightly off on a cold morning. That's not the kind of thing a person like that stops to examine. Nothing about leaving for work that day felt like it needed a second look. By the time he was halfway through his commute, he'd noticed a faint scratching sensation in his throat that he put down to the cold air. He kept clearing his throat on and off through the morning, the kind of thing you do without really thinking about it. By that evening, the discomfort had shifted into a dull, persistent ache behind his sternum that got worse when he swallowed. He took ibuprofen, went to bed early, figured he was coming down with something. By March 9th, the pain had gotten bad enough that he called in sick. He was barely eating, drinking carefully. He had no idea what had actually happened 2 days before. What was going on inside him was a slow esophageal perforation. The fragment had lodged in the lower esophageal wall and was working through the tissue with every swallow. The lower esophagus sits just above the diaphragm, and once the wall gives way there, bacteria don't have far to travel. The mediastinum, the chest cavity between the lungs, becomes contaminated almost immediately, and from there the infection can track downward through the diaphragm into the peritoneal cavity surrounding the abdominal organs. It doesn't take long. By March 10th, Dave had a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. His abdomen had become rigid and tender, and the pain had gotten bad enough that he could barely sit upright. A friend who stopped by that evening found him on the couch and called for help. Imaging confirmed esophageal perforation and extensive contamination throughout the mediastinal and peritoneal space. A glass fragment, approximately 9 millimeters in length, was identified at the perforation site in the lower esophageal wall. The peritonitis was already advanced, widespread bacterial contamination with sepsis taking hold. Surgical intervention was attempted, but his condition kept declining through the following day. Septic shock developed on March 11th. Dave died on March 12th, 5 days after that morning smoothie. The fragment recovered was consistent with the blender jar material. The jar had a propagated fracture along the base with a section missing that matched the recovered fragment exactly. Cause of death was confirmed as septic shock, secondary to esophageal perforation and peritonitis. Every symptom in those first 2 days had pointed to something completely ordinary, nothing that would make a person stop and reconsider their morning routine. The manner of death was recorded as accidental. It was July 13, 2018, in Tacoma, Washington. Warm air hung over the city after a dry afternoon, and most apartment windows stayed shut to block outside noise. Inside one second-floor unit, steam from boiling noodles mixed with heavy heat from a crowded kitchen, while music played softly through phone speakers. The apartment belonged to Elena Ruiz, 29, a hairstylist who spent most weekdays working long salon shifts before going home to stream food dares and reaction videos with friends at night. The streams were small, but people kept watching because Elena is like someone you'd actually want to hang out with. She joked easily, laughed at herself constantly, and never seemed uncomfortable on camera, no matter how ridiculous the challenge got. She had had asthma since childhood, but it had always been mild enough that she barely treated it like a real problem. Most days, her inhaler stayed forgotten in her car. The challenge that night sounded simple enough. Finish a bowl of noodles coated in an extremely spicy homemade sauce built around concentrated capsaicin powder they ordered online. They mixed everything without measurement, like most of us probably would. But what the group underestimates is that capsaicin does not just make food taste painfully spicy. Once strong pepper powder hits the steam and heat, it can spread through the air fast. In a cramped kitchen with poor ventilation, everyone inside was breathing it, whether they realized it or not. The stream started around 9 p.m. Early footage showed everyone laughing, coughing, and reaching for milk between bites. Elena started coughing harder than the others within the first few minutes, but nobody thought much of it because everyone looked miserable anyway. That probably delayed the reaction more than anything. As the noodles kept steaming, the capsaicin kept building inside the room. Around 10 minutes in, everyone's eyes were watering. Elena had already stopped eating, but her coughing never fully settled down. A wheeze started underneath it, quiet at first, then sharper every few breaths. By around 15 minutes, her breathing had become tight enough that even people in the live stream comments were asking if she was okay. But Elena was already struggling badly by then, gripping the table with both hands while her shoulders pulled inward with every short, rapid breath. Then, suddenly, the coughing stopped completely, and that's the scariest moment in the entire case. Investigators later said the silence likely meant her airway had nearly closed off. Elena stood up fast, knocked her chair backward, then collapsed onto the kitchen floor. People nearby heard a high-pitched squeal coming from her throat as she tried pulling in air. Emergency services were called immediately, but by the time paramedics arrived, Elena's lips and fingernails had already turned grayish-blue from oxygen loss. Emergency crews gave oxygen and injected bronchodilators on the floor of the apartment. She went into cardiac arrest before reaching the hospital and was pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled the death was acute respiratory failure caused by a severe asthma attack triggered by capsaicin inhalation. Her lungs showed heavy mucus buildup and widespread airway inflammation. The live stream remained online for weeks before finally being removed. Elena's younger brother later spoke publicly about the case and warned people not to treat aerosolized spice like a harmless internet challenge, especially around anyone with breathing problems.
It was October 21st, 2017, just outside Macon, Georgia. The clearing sat a few miles off a dirt access road, quiet except for a small fire pit and a cluster of tents arranged in a loose circle. The trip had come together quickly. It started as a birthday suggestion, something different for the weekend, and by late morning, it had settled into a steady rhythm of food, drinks, and conversation. Nolan Pierce had just turned 34. He hadn't planned anything elaborate. His friends suggested camping, and he went along with it. By the time everyone arrived, coolers were already open, drinks were being passed around, and a folding table had been set up with whatever food they had brought. The drinking started early. By late morning, Nolan had already gone through several rounds. Nothing out of the ordinary for the group, just enough to slow things slightly and dull coordination. He stayed on his feet, moving between conversations, checking the fire and keeping things going. That's when the food started circulating. Someone brought out a plastic container filled with cooked food, something picked up earlier that morning and packed in for the trip. It was passed around casually, with no real attention paid to what it was or how it had been prepared. Nolan took a handful, ate it quickly, and kept talking, still holding a drink in his other hand. The container moved through the group. Nothing about the moment stood out. No one stopped. No one questioned it. It blended into everything else happening around the fire. For the next several minutes, nothing changed. Nolan Nolan stayed upright, still moving, still talking. From the outside, everything looked consistent. Same pace, same behavior, nothing that suggested a problem. Then he slowed down. Mid-conversation, he paused, resting one hand briefly against the edge of the table. It didn't look serious, the kind of pause people associate with alcohol catching up. He reached for his drink again, took a sip, and stayed where he was. But the pause didn't pass. His balance shifted slightly, subtle at first, then more noticeable. His coordination dropped in a way that didn't correct itself. He turned away from the group and leaned forward, one hand braced against his leg. Within seconds, the nausea hit. He didn't move far enough away. When he vomited, it was sudden and uncontrolled. Alcohol had already impaired his airway reflexes, and instead of clearing, material entered his airway. He coughed, but it didn't resolve. His breathing changed quickly, shallow and ineffective. He tried to pull in air, but it wasn't enough. His coordination broke down. He dropped his drink, then dropped to one knee. At first, it didn't look like choking. There was no visible obstruction, no immediate panic, just a rapid loss of control that didn't match what anyone expected. That delay mattered. By the time others stepped in, his breathing was already compromised. He collapsed beside the fire pit. I've seen a lot of you comment on how dumb it is to die while eating, but this is exactly the kind of situation that doesn't feel dangerous when it's happening. It's just food, just drinks, just a normal moment until your body doesn't respond the way it should. Emergency services were called immediately. When paramedics arrived, Nolan was unresponsive. They began airway management and resuscitation on scene before transporting him, but the oxygen loss had already caused severe damage. At the hospital, attempts to restore breathing were unsuccessful. The investigation found no trauma or external injury. Witness accounts were consistent: food, alcohol, normal activity, followed by a sudden collapse. Medical findings confirmed asphyxia due to aspiration during vomiting. Toxicology showed alcohol levels high enough to impair protective airway reflexes. The food consumed, cooked, foraged mushrooms contained no lethal toxins, though mild irritation may have triggered nausea. Investigators concluded the death resulted from aspiration during acute alcohol intoxication, with recent food ingestion as a contributing factor. It was August 14th, 2014, outside Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. The heat had settled in the way it does in late summer in the bayou country, heavy and still, the air sitting close over the water and the grass along the canal banks gone brown at the edges from weeks without rain. Clyde Arsenault, 58, had been working as a crawfish trapper in the area for most of his adult life. His days had a fixed shape to them. Up before dawn, out along the canal routes, checking traps, pulling lines, moving slowly through the waterways he had worked so many times he knew them by the sound the water made against the banks. He had grown up eating what the water gave him: crawfish, catfish, frogs, snapping turtle when he caught one worth keeping. His mother had made turtle stew, and her mother before her, and the recipe had not changed much across those generations. Catch it, butcher it, cook it long and slow with whatever vegetables were on hand. It was not a special occasion meal, it was just food from the water. And look, I want to be clear about something before we go any further. Clyde was not doing anything wrong. This was not ignorance. This was a tradition passed down through generations in that part of Louisiana. The danger was not in what he did, it was in where the water had been. That morning, he was working a stretch of drainage canal he did not usually cover. One of his regular routes had been running light, and he had extended his circuit to make up the difference. The canal ran along the back boundary of a piece of land that had once housed a chemical storage operation. The facility had been decommissioned years earlier. The land sat unused, overgrown along the fence line. The water in the canal slow and standing in places where the flow had been interrupted by silt and debris. There were no warning signs posted at the waterline. No barriers, nothing that marked it as different from any of the other drainage canals he had worked across his career. To Clyde, it looked like water. He pulled a large snapping turtle from near the bank and put it in the boat. This is the part that gets me every time I read this case. There were no signs, no barriers, no information posted at that waterline that could have told him anything was different about that canal. That turtle had been living in that water for years, long enough for anything in that canal to settle into it without ever being visible from the surface. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about it would have made him hesitate. And whatever was in that water did not leave when it was cooked. And this is where it starts to get deeply unsettling, because cooking does not fix this. Clyde butchered the turtle later that afternoon and made a stew that evening. It tasted the way turtle stew always tasted. He ate a large portion that night and finished the rest the following day. The exposure was cumulative across both servings, the concentrated organochlorine load from the animal's fatty tissue entering his system in 2 significant doses within 24 hours. Within 2 to 3 days, the symptoms began. A tremor in his hands that had not been there before, confusion that came and went, difficulty keeping his balance when he stood. His wife noticed the confusion first and attributed it to the heat. By the 3rd day, he was unsteady on his feet and having trouble forming sentences clearly. She called for help when he collapsed in the kitchen. Paramedics arrived and transported him to a regional hospital in Opelousas. What genuinely unsettles me about that sequence is how ordinary each symptom seemed on its own. A tremor, some confusion, the heat. Each one had an explanation that had nothing to do with what was actually happening. Initial evaluation did not identify a clear source of toxicity. The symptoms were consistent with neurological involvement, but the cause was not immediately apparent. Broad-spectrum toxicology testing was initiated, but the initial screens were not conclusive. Organochlorine compounds require specialized testing that is not part of standard panels, and the results take time to return. These compounds are lipophilic, binding to fat rather than water, which allows them to concentrate in tissue and resist elimination. They are persistent, slow to break down, and in sufficient concentrations affect the nervous system while placing significant stress on the liver. Cooking does not remove them. His condition continued to deteriorate while the testing was pending. Clyde Arsenault died on the 9th day following the meal. He was 58 years old. Toxicology results returned after his death, indicating exposure consistent with high-level organochlorine pesticide accumulation at levels the reviewing toxicologist described as unusually elevated for a single exposure and consistent with consumption of heavily contaminated tissue from a bioaccumulating animal. Snapping turtles are long-lived bioaccumulators, storing contaminants in their fatty tissue over time. The canal Clyde picked the turtle had tested positive for organochlorine pesticides years earlier, though this was never posted. A warning sign was installed at the waterline the following spring. The part of this case that stayed with me is that warning sign. It went up the following spring, after he was already gone. The information that could have saved him existed for years before that morning. It just never reached the one person who needed it. It was February 14th, 2018, in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The morning temperature hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, as frost covered the windows of an industrial meat processing facility on the city's south side. Inside the building, the production floor maintained a controlled temperature of 45 degrees, while workers prepared for the day's operations. Zelby Knock, a 52-year-old production worker, had nearly 15 years of experience at the facility that processed bulk ground meat products. His assigned station involved feeding trimmed beef cuts into a large industrial grinder capable of processing hundreds of pounds of meat per hour. Zelby was known among his colleagues as a reliable employee who rarely missed work and maintained consistent production rates. The industrial grinder stood approximately 4 feet tall, with a large stainless steel hopper that funneled meat downward through a rotating auger screw. Safety protocols required workers to use metal pushers to guide meat toward the auger, while keeping hands away from the hopper opening. That morning, workers were processing trays containing thick cuts of beef with substantial amounts of connective tissue and sinew. These tougher portions occasionally created problems when large pieces became wedged inside the hopper. The standard procedure involved stopping the machine and using approved tools to clear any obstructions. Zelby was feeding trimmed cuts of beef into the grinder's hopper, while the machine operated at normal speed. The rotating auger pulled the beef cuts downward through the grinding chamber, producing the steady grinding sound typical of normal operation. During one feeding cycle, a particularly thick slab of beef containing dense connective tissue became wedged partway into the hopper. The auger continued rotating, attempting to pull the obstruction downward, but the meat remained stuck against the hopper walls. The grinding sound changed to a labored mechanical noise as the motor worked against the resistance. Rather than following protocol to stop the machine, Zelby reached into the hopper with his gloved hand to push the jammed meat toward the moving auger screw. As he applied pressure to the obstruction, the meat suddenly shifted and moved downward. The rotating auger immediately caught the loose fabric of his work glove, which had become entangled with the meat. The powerful mechanism began pulling his glove and hand downward into the grinding chamber. The auger's rotation generated enough force to pull his hand and forearm into the grinding mechanism within seconds. Multiple co-workers working at nearby stations heard the change in the machine's operational sound and turned to investigate. They observed Zelby's predicament and immediately rushed toward the grinder as another worker moved to activate the emergency stop controls. A worker stationed approximately 15 feet away reached the emergency stop switch and activated it, but the heavy industrial motor required several seconds to slow the rotating auger to a complete stop. The delay allowed the mechanism to cause severe traumatic injuries before the machine ceased operation. Emergency medical services arrived within minutes and worked with facility maintenance staff to safely extract Zelby from the equipment. Paramedics confirmed he had sustained catastrophic injuries from the grinding mechanism that proved fatal. Investigators documented the jammed meat still lodged inside the hopper and noted the torn work glove material found within the grinding chamber. The incident report concluded that the death resulted from contact with moving machinery during an attempt to clear an obstruction without stopping the equipment. Following the investigation, the facility temporarily suspended operations while safety procedures were reviewed and additional safeguards were implemented around the grinding equipment.
It was June 3rd, 2017. Pilsen, on Chicago's Lower West Side, is the kind of neighborhood that feels genuinely lived in. Dense blocks, specialty markets, storefronts that have been there for decades, serving a largely immigrant community that built the place up. In early June, the weather finally turns, windows open, people out on the street, the whole neighborhood running at full volume. Kaylee Thoan was 31. She'd grown up in the Chicago area, daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, and worked as a dental hygienist on the North Side. Social, close with a tight group of people, and genuinely into cooking, the kind of food she'd grown up eating at home specifically. That evening, she was at a casual dinner at a friend's second-floor walk-up, 5 people around a small table with the windows open, nobody checking the time. The kind of dinner where the food is the whole point. The host had picked up freshwater crab that morning from a specialty import market a few blocks away and spent most of the day making a traditional Vietnamese crab soup the way her family always had. Kaylee ate a full portion without hesitation. She'd grown up eating dishes like this her whole life. I mean, we all have that one thing we grew up eating that we'd never in a million years think could hurt us, right? Freshwater crab is the base of bun rio, a slow-cooked soup built around crab paste and tomato that takes most of the day to develop. The crab is processed by hand, the paste worked into the broth over low heat, the kind of dish you make when the occasion means something. What wasn't known that evening was that the batch from the import market had never been inspected and the crab hadn't reached the internal temperatures needed to kill parasitic larvae. It looked right, smelled right, tasted exactly like what Kaylee had eaten her whole life. There was no way to know. Kaylee felt completely fine for the first several days after the dinner. By June 9th, she started getting intermittent sharp pains along her lower back and left leg. She figured she'd pulled something at work, maybe from the repetitive positioning that comes with leaning over patients all day. By June 14th, the pain had gotten significantly worse, and she'd developed noticeable weakness in her left leg. A general practitioner suspected a herniated disc and recommended rest and anti-inflammatories, which made complete sense given her job. By June 17th, she'd lost most motor function in her left leg and was having severe headaches. She was admitted that evening. Imaging told a completely different story. Hemorrhagic lesions along her spinal cord, early intracranial involvement. Something had entered the spinal canal and was migrating upward toward the brainstem. Gnathostoma larvae in the central nervous system don't settle somewhere and stay put. They keep moving through tissue continuously, leaving bleeding tracks along every path they cut through. That's what hemorrhagic meningitis looks like in this context. By June 18th, Kaylee had lost all motor function below the waist. By June 20th, the bleeding had reached the brainstem. She lost consciousness that afternoon and never came back from it. Kaylee died the next day, 18 days after that dinner. Cause of death was confirmed as hemorrhagic meningoencephalitis secondary to cerebral nathostomiasis. Post-mortem identified larval migration tracts throughout the spinal cord and brainstem tissue. The freshwater crab was traced to the import market and back to a Southeast Asian supplier. Larvae were identified in a remaining portion of the same batch. The other 4 people at that dinner either ate smaller portions or had theirs more thoroughly cooked, and none of them developed symptoms. The import market was flagged for sourcing uninspected freshwater crustacean product. The case was ruled accidental. It was October 11, 2015. Caldwell, Ohio is deep Appalachian country. Rolling hills, narrow roads, houses far enough apart that nobody really notices what's going on at the neighbor's place. Mid-October out there means frost in the hollows, gray skies that don't lift, and older homes that run damp in their lower levels because the foundations were never properly sealed, just part of living there. Rafe Munden was 53. He'd lived alone in the same house outside Caldwell for over 2 decades, inherited it from his parents, and had no real plans to go anywhere else. He worked part-time as an equipment mechanic for a local farming operation. Practical, self-sufficient, the kind of man who fixed things himself and spent as little as necessary. He kept a large stock of dry goods in his basement: cornmeal, flour, dried beans, oats, bulk purchases he rotated through slowly, the way a lot of people in that part of Ohio do. The basement had a moisture problem he'd been meaning to deal with for years, and neighbors had mentioned seeing rats around the property the previous spring. He'd set a few traps and figured that was the end of it. He lived alone, saw his co-workers a few days a week, and had no immediate family nearby. A damp basement full of bulk dry goods isn't unusual in that part of Ohio. It's practical. It's how a lot of households in rural areas manage food storage, and it works fine the vast majority of the time. The moisture problem had been there for years without consequence. The rat traps had seemed like enough. There was no reason from where Rafe was standing to treat any of it as urgent. Rafe used cornmeal from a basement bag sometime during the week of October 11th. The exact date isn't certain. When investigators examined that bag later, they found gnaw marks along the lower seam and dried rat droppings inside the folds of the outer packaging. Nothing about the cornmeal itself would have looked or smelled any different, which makes me wonder how many people are storing food the exact same way right now without thinking twice about it. By October 16th, his coworker noticed he looked off, pale, headaches, muscle aches. Rafe chalked it up to a cold and left it at that. By October 18th, he hadn't shown up for 2 days and wasn't answering. His coworker drove out and found him inside, conscious but in genuinely bad shape, jaundiced, confused, and with bruising spreading across his abdomen and sides that he couldn't explain. And that bruising is worth paying attention to. It wasn't from any impact. Leptospira, in its severe form, breaks down blood vessel walls throughout the body, causing them to leak into surrounding tissue, into the abdominal cavity, into the lungs. He'd been hemorrhaging internally across multiple sites for days and had no idea. I think most people picture internal bleeding as something you'd feel immediately. This case is a pretty good argument against that. His liver was in acute failure, kidney function had already dropped critically, and internal bleeding was confirmed in multiple locations. His kidneys shut down completely on October 19th. The following day, pulmonary hemorrhage developed, bleeding directly into the lung tissue, and his breathing deteriorated fast. He died on October 20th, 9 days after the estimated exposure. Post-mortem confirmed Leptospira interrogans, consistent with Weil's disease. The cornmeal bag tested positive for Leptospira contamination. Rat activity in that basement was far more extensive than a few traps would have touched. Compromised packaging on multiple food items, dried urine soaked into the shelving, long-term infestation throughout. The manner of death was recorded as accidental. It was November 14th, 2014, along the shoreline of Sorsogon Bay in the Philippines. Low tide exposed long stretches of wet mudflats beneath a gray morning sky, while small fishing boats rested quietly near shore. Across the barangay, families moved through the shallows collecting shellfish after several calm days at sea. Honestly, it looked like a completely normal morning. Lena Villanueva was 38, a school janitor and single mother of 3. After her husband left years earlier, she handled everything herself. When her oldest son developed kidney problems, neighbors noticed Lena quietly eating smaller portions so the kids could have more. Her youngest daughter's birthday was 2 days away, and she had promised a proper seafood dinner instead of canned food and rice. Harvesting shellfish during low tide was common there. Families regularly collected clams, crabs, and reef fish trapped between rocks because it was cheap food and something people had done safely for years. And that's what makes the red tide so dangerous. The shellfish usually look completely normal. They do not smell rotten or appear contaminated in any obvious way. Earlier that week, dead fish had washed onto nearby shorelines, and local officials had already started discussing possible red tide activity. But the warning never reached their barangay in time. By sunset, rain tapped against the family's tin roof while relatives crowded inside the small concrete house. Lena cooked garlic shellfish soup while the children sliced tomatoes beside the doorway. Relatives later described it as one of the happiest evenings the family had shared in months. About an hour after dinner, Lena mentioned that her lips felt numb. Her son assumed she had burned her mouth on the soup, but within minutes, the tingling spread into her fingers. Her sister suddenly vomited into the sink, while another relative complained that her legs felt weak. The children remained mostly fine because investigators later believed the adults had eaten much larger portions of shellfish while giving more fish meat to the kids. When Lena stood from the table, her knees collapsed beneath her, and her shoulder slammed hard into the wall. A cousin immediately flagged down a tricycle to rush everyone toward the nearest clinic, roughly 30 minutes away. And honestly, this is where the story turns brutal very fast. Before they even reached the road, Lena's legs had stopped working completely, and relatives had to carry her into the vehicle. During the drive, her arms slowly stopped responding. Her breathing became shallow and uneven. Witnesses said foam gathered around her mouth while her fingertips darkened from oxygen loss. The scariest part was that she stayed conscious through most of it, aware of what was happening, but unable to stop it. Clinic staff suspected paralytic shellfish poisoning almost immediately. Oxygen was started within minutes, but by then the toxin had already been shutting down the nerves controlling her muscles for nearly half an hour. She went into respiratory arrest roughly 40 minutes after arriving. CPR and ventilation could not save her. 2 relatives survived after intensive treatment. Lena died later that night. The post-mortem confirmed saxitoxin poisoning from red tide-contaminated shellfish. The toxin had gradually paralyzed the muscles needed for breathing while leaving her conscious through much of the process. 3 days later, officials finally issued a red tide warning across Sorsogon Bay. Neighbors collected donations for Lena's children. At her daughter's next birthday, the family served only packaged food indoors. Several relatives later admitted they still could not bring themselves to walk those shorelines again.
It was March 3, 2015, in Portland, Oregon. Overnight temperatures dropped below freezing, so the apartment stayed sealed to hold warmth, and a converted pantry, small, insulated, and windowless, held more than just ingredients by morning. Tessa Bloom was 29. She ran a small sourdough business out of her home, and for the first time she had a bulk order large enough to supply a weekend crowd. It was the kind of opportunity she had been working toward. More exposure, more customers, but it also meant scaling everything up inside the same tight system she used every day. The pantry became the center of that workload. It was a narrow, insulated room just off the kitchen, originally meant for dry storage. Tessa had repurposed it into a fermentation space to keep temperatures stable overnight. Shelves ran from floor to shoulder height, packed with containers of active starter and rising dough. To hold warmth, she kept the door closed. There was no vent, no airflow, just a sealed space doing more work than it was built for. That night, the volume changed everything. Instead of a few batches, she filled nearly every shelf. Large containers, tightly spaced, all fermenting at once. Each one released carbon dioxide as the yeast worked. Normally harmless in an open room, but in a confined space, it builds. In a confined space, the gas can accumulate and reduce oxygen levels without any visible sign. By morning, fermentation had been running for hours. Tessa woke up early and went straight to the kitchen. The rest of the apartment felt normal, quiet, slightly warm, nothing out of place. She set down her tools, checked the counter, then reached for the pantry door. She opened it like she always did. Nothing looked wrong. The dough had risen well. The containers were intact. The air didn't carry any strong warning, just the usual faint sourness of fermentation. From the doorway, everything looked exactly the way she wanted it. She leaned in. The lower shelves held the largest batches, so she bent slightly, reaching forward to check one of the containers near the floor. That's when it shifted. The first breath felt heavier than expected. The second came shorter. Within moments, the oxygen level in that space, already reduced by accumulated carbon dioxide, dropped below what her body needed to stay stable. There was no instinct to pull away, no choking, no burning, just a sudden change in balance. She paused, one hand on the shelf as her coordination started to slip. It looked subtle, like someone losing focus for a second, but her body was already compensating for a lack of oxygen it couldn't correct. She tried to step back. Her foot didn't land where she expected. Her shoulder brushed the frame, and she reached out to steady herself, missing the edge of the doorway. By then, the dizziness had already deepened into confusion. The signals were there, but they didn't feel like danger, just disorientation. Moments later, her body stopped compensating. She collapsed near the pantry entrance. A neighbor downstairs later reported hearing a dull thud around 5:40 a.m., but it sounded like something dropped in the kitchen, so no one checked. The apartment stayed quiet after that. Tessa's boyfriend arrived just after 7 a.m. and found her on the floor, partially turned toward the open pantry. He called 911 immediately. Portland Fire and Rescue responded within minutes. Paramedics began resuscitation on scene, but there were no signs of prolonged struggle. No overturned shelves, no attempt to move far from where she fell, just a rapid collapse consistent with sudden oxygen deprivation. Investigators focused on the pantry. Air testing showed elevated carbon dioxide levels and reduced oxygen concentration inside the confined space. The layout explained the rest: low shelving, sealed conditions, and unusually high fermentation volume from the festival preparation. The medical examiner ruled the death as accidental asphyxia due to oxygen displacement. And that's what makes this case difficult to recognize. Nothing about it looked dangerous. No smoke, no leak. No visible failure, just a routine step in a process she trusted, opening a door, leaning in, checking her work. But that morning, the scale had changed the system, and by the time her body reacted, there wasn't enough oxygen left to recover. It was June 16, 2017, in Westerville, Ohio. The graduation party had been running for a few hours by the time the dare came up. It was a backyard gathering, the kind that forms naturally after a ceremony. Easy and informal, phones out and the mood relaxed. It was the kind of night that felt like it was going exactly the way it was supposed to. Brandon Fells, 19, had graduated that week from his high school. His friends described him as someone who never backed down from a challenge, the type who would rather take the dare than be the one who said no in front of a group. He had the rest of the summer ahead of him, and a loose plan to start a trade program in the fall. That evening, someone in the group produced a 1/4 pound of raw ground beef that had been sitting in the cooler. The dare was simple: eat it on camera for the group chat. Brandon looked at the beef, looked at the camera, and agreed without much deliberation. And I want to be honest, I understand that moment completely. 19 years old, graduation night, your whole group watching. The dare feels smaller than it is because everything else feels big. That is exactly how these things happen. What most people at that party didn't know, and what Brandon didn't consider, was that eating raw ground beef is not the same as taking a bite out of a rare steak. There's a reason it's handled differently, a reason it's not meant to be eaten that way. But in that moment, none of that felt important. Brandon looked at the beef, looked at the camera, and ate the entire portion in one sitting while his friends reacted the way groups react to dares. The video was posted to the group chat at 11:43 that night. Brandon was laughing in the final frame. He felt fine when he went home, and fine when he woke up the following morning. The 2 days that followed were unremarkable. He had no reason to think anything was wrong. This is where it starts to get dark. The symptoms began around day 2 to 3. Abdominal cramping at first, the kind that is easy to write off as something minor. Then diarrhea. Then it got worse. The organism responsible was E. coli 0157:H7, a strain that produces a toxin called Shiga toxin. Most E. coli strains cause illness that resolves on its own within a week. 0157:H7 is different. The Shiga toxin it produces does not stay contained in the gut, the way standard gastrointestinal illness does. It crosses into the bloodstream and begins attacking the walls of small blood vessels throughout the body. The damage it does is systemic. By day 4, the diarrhea had become bloody. The cramping had become severe, and Brandon sought medical care. The gastrointestinal phase was intense, and the illness was clearly beyond something that would resolve at home. What developed next was hemolytic uremic syndrome, a serious complication that occurs in a portion of E. coli 0157:H7 infections and is most common in children and young adults. The strain produces a toxin that can enter the bloodstream and damage small blood vessels, leading to kidney failure. Investigators later pointed to the raw ground beef as the source. Unlike whole cuts of meat, where bacteria are typically confined to the surface, ground beef distributes contamination throughout the entire product during processing. Cooking is what eliminates that risk. Without it, any bacteria present is consumed directly. He was admitted to a local hospital and later transferred to a facility in Columbus with a specialized unit for kidney failure in young patients. Dialysis was started as his condition continued to decline, but the damage to his kidneys and vascular system could not be reversed. Brandon Fells died on June 29, 2017, 13 days after the graduation party. The video he had posted to the group chat at 11:43 that night remained online for the entire duration of his illness. His family requested it be removed after his death. I can't imagine that video sitting in that group chat for 13 days and his friends watching it while he was in the hospital. It was March 12, 2016, in Dayton, Ohio. The afternoon sun filtered through thin clouds, casting a pale light across the modest apartment complex on the city's east side. Inside a second-floor unit, the small kitchen carried the familiar sounds of daily life, the hum of an old refrigerator, and the distant murmur of traffic outside. Laura Pratt, a 34-year-old delivery driver, had recently cut back her work hours to spend more time at home with her 4-year-old son. The decision meant tighter finances, forcing her to find creative ways to stretch their grocery budget. That morning, she had purchased a large container of powdered milk during her weekly shopping trip, viewing it as a practical alternative to the more expensive liquid variety. Laura possessed a naturally curious personality and often demonstrated new foods to her son, believing it would encourage him to try different things. She was known among friends as someone who approached life with enthusiasm, sometimes acting on impulse without fully considering consequences. Her co-workers at the delivery company often remarked on her willingness to taste test unusual items during lunch breaks. This adventurous nature extended to her parenting style, where she frequently introduced her son to new experiences and encouraged exploration. As her son sat at the small dining table, working quietly in a coloring book, Laura opened the new container of powdered milk in the kitchen. The white powder filled the plastic container to the brim. She had prepared a full 12-ounce glass of tap water on the counter, intending to mix it with the powder for an afternoon snack. The kitchen window was slightly open, allowing a gentle breeze to circulate through the small space. Wanting to show her son that the powder tasted good, even before adding water, Laura scooped a large handful of the dry milk powder. Without hesitation, she poured the entire amount directly into her mouth to demonstrate its flavor. The powder immediately began absorbing moisture from her saliva, forming thick, paste-like clumps against her tongue and the back of her throat. As she attempted to swallow the expanding mass, she reached for the glass of water beside her. Her elbow struck the glass, sending it tumbling off the counter onto the tile floor below, where it shattered into pieces. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Laura began coughing violently as the powder continued to thicken in her throat. As she coughed and struggled to breathe, the thickened powder and saliva mixture began entering her airway, forming dense obstructions. The compacted material blocked her upper respiratory tract completely. Within minutes, airflow stopped entirely. Lara collapsed onto the kitchen floor beside the broken glass and spilled water, the opened container of powdered milk still sitting on the counter above. Her son's loud crying alerted a neighbor in the adjoining apartment. The neighbor entered through the unlocked front door and discovered Lara unconscious on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the evidence of what had occurred. Emergency responders arrived and immediately began airway management while performing CPR. Paramedics attempted suction and airway clearing procedures, but the thickened milk residue and aspirated material had already caused severe airway obstruction deep within the upper airway passages. Despite continued resuscitation efforts, the blockage had already prevented adequate airflow for several critical minutes. The coroner's examination later documented thick milk residue throughout the upper airway passages, consistent with aspirated powdered milk. The death was officially ruled accidental asphyxia caused by aspirated powdered milk. The incident report noted the broken glass, spilled water, and open container as evidence supporting the sequence of events that led to the fatal choking incident. The apartment complex management later reviewed safety protocols for emergency access procedures.
It was September 4th, 2015. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in central Idaho is one of the largest roadless areas in the entire country. In early September, the trails thin out fast, temperatures drop into the low 40s degrees Fahrenheit after dark, and the nearest trailhead can sit 20 or more miles from the nearest paved road. Win Olson was 34. He worked as a land surveyor out of Missoula, Montana, spent most of his working hours outdoors reading terrain, moving through it. That kind of job builds a comfort level in the backcountry that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't have it. Solo trips weren't a big deal to him. No group, no guide, just him and a route he'd been thinking about for months. A 9-day loop through the Selway drainage, roughly 47 miles, a section of which he'd already done before. Among the food he packed were several jars of venison he'd home-canned himself the previous winter, something he'd done before without any problems. Before he left, he gave his older brother the route details and his return date, September 13th. That was it. One person knew where he was. That's not negligence. That's standard practice for experienced solo travelers. You leave a route, you leave a return date, and that's considered doing it right. The problem wasn't the plan. The problem was that by September 8th, the margin had already closed. Wynn made camp on the evening of September 6th, near a creek crossing at around 4,800 feet elevation. He heated one of the venison jars over his stove, ate. Nothing seemed off. By the afternoon of September 7th, his trail journal mentioned unusual fatigue and a dull headache. He chalked it up to elevation. That evening, the entries got more specific. Vision slightly off. Swallowing felt strange. He ate very little and made no connection to the food, which honestly makes sense. He'd made that venison himself, eaten it before. Nothing had ever happened. By the morning of September 8th, the paralysis had started moving through him in a way that couldn't be ignored. Botulinum toxin doesn't cause pain the way most people imagine. It just quietly cuts the line between the nervous system and the muscles. Jaw first, then the neck, then the arms. His journal entry that morning was noticeably different. Uneven handwriting, short, fragmented sentences. He wrote that his arms felt heavy and that he couldn't get his pack on. There's nothing after 9 a.m. That was the last entry he ever made. What happened after that can be reconstructed from the physical evidence and the known progression of untreated botulism. By midday, he likely couldn't walk. Sometime in the early afternoon, the paralysis would have reached his diaphragm, the muscle that drives breathing. And this is the part that gets me. Botulinum toxin doesn't affect cognition at all. His mind would have been completely clear the entire time. He knew exactly what was happening, and there was nothing he could do about it. Fully conscious, slowly losing the ability to breathe, alone in the middle of 1.3 million acres with no one within miles. His brother reached out to authorities on September 14th when Wynn didn't return to his truck. A search team found him on September 15th, approximately 2.3 miles from his last camp, off the main trail, partially sheltered against a large downed tree. His pack was beside him with 2 unopened venison jars still inside. The opened jar from September 6th was recovered at the campsite. His GPS recorded his last movement at 1:47 p.m. on September 8th. The medical examiner confirmed botulinum toxin type A as the cause of death. The recovered venison jar tested positive for Clostridium botulinum. No visible spoilage, no swelling, nothing on the outside of that jar that would have told him anything was wrong. Time of death was estimated between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. on September 8th. He had taken the last of the canning batch with him. Nobody else got sick. The case was ruled accidental.
It was February 14, 2014 in Dayton, Ohio. Dinner was underway inside a small single-family home on Bellbrook Avenue, the kind of quiet evening where nothing stands out, but within minutes, a routine meal would turn into something no one there expected. Leon Varga, 53, wasn't just known for fixing watches. He had a habit of turning small things into demonstrations. If something looked off or unpleasant, he didn't avoid it. He proved it didn't matter. At home, that usually showed up in the way he ate. Fast, distracted, and often turning minor inconveniences into jokes just to get a reaction. That night's dinner was simple: soup, bread, and a bowl of fruit set in the middle of the table. Mixed in were slices of kiwi, some peeled, some left with the fuzzy skin still on. When Leon picked one up, a thin strand of hair was stuck across the surface, caught in the fruit's texture. Someone told him to throw it out. Instead, he pulled the hair free, held it up, and laughed it off, turning it into a point. Then, without cutting the fruit down, he picked up a larger slice, still partially unpeeled, and said it didn't make a difference. To prove it, he ate it anyway. It didn't look dangerous. It looked unnecessary, but harmless. And that's where it shifted. The texture worked against him. The soft fruit compressed while the fibrous skin and leftover strands didn't break apart cleanly. As he tried to swallow, something caught, likely caused by the fruit's texture and irritation. It created just enough of a reflex to trigger airway tightening. He coughed once, then again, sharper. But instead of clearing, the reaction deepened. His airway didn't open, it tightened. He stood up quickly, pushing his chair back and moved toward the sink, trying to clear his throat. But the more he tried to breathe, the less air moved. There was no solid piece blocking him, nothing obvious to remove, just a tightening that didn't release. He bent forward, coughing again, but the sound had shifted. His breaths were shallow, strained, and out of sync. His sister noticed first that something was wrong, not because he stopped breathing, but because he couldn't get a full breath in at all. A 911 call went out at about 6:18 p.m. By the time medics arrived roughly 6 minutes later, Leon was on the floor near the cabinets. He still had a weak pulse, but his airway was compromised, so responders began oxygen and airway support before transporting him. At the hospital, resuscitation continued, but the lack of oxygen had already caused irreversible damage. The forensic findings showed plant material and trace fibers consistent with the fruit in the airway, with asphyxia caused by aspiration and laryngeal spasm. In simple terms, the combination of food and irritation triggered a reflex that closed his airway instead of clearing it. The death was ruled accidental. There was no hidden condition, no rare disease, just a sequence built around something that didn't need to happen. A piece of fruit, a strand of hair, and a decision to turn it into a moment instead of stopping. And that's the part that stays with me, because it wasn't just the food, it was the need to prove it didn't matter. It was August 12, 2017 in Setagaya, Tokyo, Japan. The late summer air inside the compact apartment felt heavy and unmoving, thick with steam from freshly boiled noodles. Windows were shut against insects. Humidity clung to the walls. Outside, cicadas droned through the fading light. That evening, Elias Navarro, 26, was preparing for a food challenge he had planned carefully. A Filipino living in Tokyo, he worked as a private English tutor, traveling between small apartments and cafes to coach students preparing for exams. Online videos supplemented what tutoring alone could not provide. His content focused on controlled extremes: one-bite challenges, oversized portions, and strict timing. He rehearsed posture and pacing before each session. The festival noodle had been custom-made by a neighborhood shop, one continuous strand nearly 4 feet long, and thick as his little finger. It was dense, high-gluten dough, boiled firm and rinsed cold to preserve structure. That day, Tokyo remained under a heat advisory warning of elevated heat stroke risk. His apartment air conditioner struggled against the humidity. He had been talking and preparing for over an hour. Dry indoor air and prolonged speaking can reduce saliva, which helps lubricate food and coordinate swallowing. He had eaten very little earlier to leave room for the challenge. The noodle lay coiled in a bowl, slick with soy-based dipping sauce. He positioned it carefully, lifted one end, and began pulling it into his mouth. The first foot slid past his teeth smoothly. He leaned forward to maintain tension, pulling the strand steadily to keep it aligned and unbroken. Halfway through, the noodle thickened slightly, where the dough had folded during shaping. His rhythm faltered. Instead of chewing or pausing, he inhaled sharply to finish the pull. The sudden inhale came just as the heavy strand reached the back of his throat. Rather than entering the lungs, which is uncommon with large, solid food, the noodle compressed against the entrance of the larynx. He coughed hard. The strand folded on itself and became lodged above and across the vocal cords, blocking airflow at the level of the glottis. He reached into his mouth, attempting to pull it free, but the sauce made it slick. Forceful pulling caused the strand to bunch tighter against the airway as throat muscles contracted. He stood abruptly, knocking a chair backward. His face shifted from red to a dusky purple. A strained wheeze escaped, but no full breath followed. With complete obstruction, effective air exchange stops. Within less than a minute, he staggered and collapsed against the low table, dislodging the bowl and scattering sauce across the floor. A neighbor heard repeated thuds and called emergency services. Call logs later confirmed paramedics arrived within several minutes. On arrival, Elias was unresponsive and pulseless. Emergency responders initiated CPR and attempted ventilation with a bag valve mask, but air could not pass through the obstruction. Using laryngoscopic equipment, they visualized a compacted mass of dough lodged across the upper airway. Attempts to remove it with forceps were only partially successful. Resuscitation efforts continued during transport, but were unsuccessful. The autopsy report described acute airway obstruction caused by aspirated food. The obstruction was located at the upper airway, consistent with mechanical blockage rather than deep lung aspiration. The noodle blocked the windpipe completely, preventing oxygen from reaching the lungs. Irreversible brain injury can begin after approximately 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, followed by cardiac arrest. No drugs or alcohol were detected. Authorities classified the death as accidental asphyxia. The noodle shop discontinued promotional continuous strand items within the week. His tutoring clients were notified that lessons would not resume, and his family handled his personal accounts privately. It was June 18, 2017, in Astoria, Oregon. The evening air carried the familiar scent of salt water and diesel fuel across the bustling marina district. Fishing boats bobbed gently in their slips as the day's catch was being unloaded under the amber glow of harbor lights. Harlan Volk, a 42-year-old dock mechanic, had just finished another long shift maintaining the hydraulic systems on several commercial fishing vessels tied along the marina. His workdays often stretched into the evening during peak fishing season, and it wasn't unusual for him to grab dinner nearby before heading home. Earlier that day, Harlan had planned to meet 2 co-workers from the docks at a small harbor cafe after their shift ended. The cafe was a familiar spot for the marina crews, a place where fishermen, mechanics, and deckhands often gathered after work. But shortly before the end of the shift, one of the men called to say they would have to cancel. A mechanical issue on one of the boats had delayed their work, and the repair would take hours. Harlan had already cleaned up and was only a short walk from the cafe. Rather than driving home right away, he decided to stop in anyway for a quick meal before leaving the marina. The establishment was modest, with weathered wooden tables and windows overlooking the working docks. Fishing boats rocked gently in their slips outside, while workers finished unloading equipment under the harbor lights. That evening, Harlan decided to try something different from the daily specials board. The server brought him a plate of thinly sliced raw fish, freshly caught that morning, and filleted at the harbor. The preparation was simple, arranged with soy sauce and minimal garnish. Like many small waterfront cafes that served the day's catch directly from local boats, the fish had gone from dock to kitchen with minimal handling. He ate quietly while watching the evening activity through the cafe window, as the marina slowly wound down for the night. Harlan had occasionally experienced mild itching and throat irritation after eating certain types of seafood in the past. The symptoms had always faded quickly, and he had never considered them serious enough to mention to a doctor. Several minutes after finishing his meal, he began feeling a familiar irritation deep in his throat. At first, it seemed minor, similar to what he had felt before, but this time, the sensation didn't fade. Instead, the scratchy feeling quickly intensified, and he began coughing intermittently while speaking with another patron seated nearby. Within moments, the irritation turned into something far more serious. His breathing became strained as swelling began developing rapidly in his throat and upper airway. As the swelling increased, the airway passages narrowed, making each breath more difficult than the last. Other diners soon noticed his distress as he struggled to breathe and clutched at his throat. Within minutes, Harlan collapsed beside his table. Restaurant staff immediately contacted emergency services while attempting to provide assistance. Emergency responders reached the cafe quickly and began treatment before transporting Harlan to the nearest hospital. Despite continued medical intervention, he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. A subsequent medical examination revealed evidence of a parasitic roundworm consistent with Anisakis species present in the upper gastrointestinal tract, along with signs of a severe allergic reaction. Investigators later determined that the raw fish served at the cafe had not undergone the parasite elimination freezing procedures typically required for raw seafood preparations.
It was August 19, 2017. The Gulf Coast of Louisiana in mid-August is brutal in a way that's hard to overstate. Temperatures pushing past 93 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. Humidity so thick it feels physical. The kind of heat where standing outside for an hour leaves you completely drained. Small coastal towns along that stretch have been running seafood festivals every summer for decades, and they draw a steady crowd, locals mostly, people who've been going to these things their whole lives. Corey Thassel was 61. He'd spent most of his working life as a freight logistics coordinator out of Baton Rouge. Desk job, steady routine, nothing that would make you look twice. By his own measure, he was in reasonable shape for his age. He drank socially, had done so consistently for years, but had never been told anything was wrong and hadn't felt the need to see a doctor in a while. That weekend, he drove out to the festival with 2 co-workers. Just a casual end-of-summer outing, a few hours outside. Some food. He ordered 2 dozen raw oysters from a vendor near the waterfront, ate them over about an hour, had a couple of beers alongside. He'd eaten raw oysters at events like this before and never had a problem. So what exactly was there to worry about? Vendors at events like that, one, operate under state inspection, pull from licensed suppliers, and turn over product fast enough that sitting inventory isn't the concern it might be elsewhere. The waterfront location, the crowd, the casual, late summer atmosphere, it was exactly the kind of setting where oysters make sense. People order them at events like this all the time. It's the kind of setup that, by every reasonable measure, you'd feel fine eating from. By that evening, roughly 6 hours after eating, Corey told one of his co-workers he felt nauseated and feverish. They figured it was the heat. Honestly, a reasonable assumption given the conditions that day, and he drove himself home. By midnight, his fever had climbed to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and he was vomiting repeatedly. He didn't call for help, assumed it was food poisoning, and expected to feel better by morning. By August 20th, his daughter stopped by to drop something off and found him barely conscious on his bathroom floor. What had been happening inside him overnight is where this case gets genuinely hard to sit with. The bacteria had already crossed from his gut into his bloodstream and was moving through his body in a way it wouldn't in most people. The reason for that only came out later. By the time he was being assessed, the first signs of necrotizing fasciitis were already visible along his left thigh and lower abdomen. I think people hear that term and don't fully picture what it means. The skin on the surface can look relatively normal while the tissue underneath is already dead, and the destruction spreads along the connective layers between muscle and skin faster than it can be surgically removed. Over the next 18 hours, the affected area expanded from his left thigh across his abdomen and toward his chest wall, despite repeated surgical intervention. His kidneys went first, then his liver, then his cardiovascular system stopped holding up altogether. Corey died on August 21st, approximately 44 hours after eating those oysters. He never regained full consciousness after being found. Post-mortem confirmed Vibrio vulnificus septicemia as the primary cause of death. Tissue cultures from the necrotic areas confirmed the same organism throughout. Liver examination revealed significant fibrosis consistent with years of undiagnosed alcohol-related liver disease, a condition he had no knowledge of and no symptoms pointing toward. Water temperature logs from the harvest area confirmed Gulf temperatures of 86 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of collection, well within the range that supports bacterial proliferation in shellfish. No other festival attendees reported similar illness. Without that underlying liver condition, the infection almost certainly wouldn't have progressed beyond severe gastroenteritis. The investigation found no grounds for anything other than an accidental ruling. It was May 14th, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona. Temperatures were already climbing early that morning as people headed to gyms, grocery stores, and work before the afternoon heat settled in. Around the apartment complexes near Country Club Drive, residents had windows open, fans running, and air conditioners already working non-stop. Kyle Mercer was 34 and worked as a personal trainer at a small gym in Mesa, Arizona. He had a modest online following built around workout clips, protein-heavy meals, and clean eating advice. Co-workers described him as the kind of person who refused to replace anything unless it completely stopped working. And I know a lot of people are exactly like that with kitchen appliances. If it still turns on, then it's good. That mattered because Kyle's blender jar had a visible crack running down one side for weeks. That morning, he loaded the blender with frozen berries, peanut butter, ice, and protein powder before work. His roommate later said the normal grinding sound suddenly shifted into a loud crack from the kitchen. Kyle checked the outside of the blender, saw nothing obvious, poured the shake into a metal bottle, and left for work. Around noon, gym security footage showed Kyle sitting heavily against a wall between sessions while pressing a hand into his stomach. He joked to a coworker that it was probably a kidney stone or something he had eaten. Looking back, that part feels painfully normal because most people ignore stomach pain, hoping it'll eventually pass. But the pain kept getting worse. By late afternoon, he was cutting workouts short and struggling to stand upright for long periods. That evening, his roommate found him bent over the bathroom sink, vomiting dark red blood and clots while barely holding himself upright against the counter. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, where doctors initially suspected a perforated ulcer or severe internal bleeding, but scans showed something they could not immediately explain. Several small, sharp foreign objects were scattered throughout his stomach and upper intestines. Surgeons opened his abdomen that night and found widespread internal damage. Doctors later said most of the fragments were tiny, but a few larger jagged pieces had sliced deeper into the tissue. Parts of his stomach and intestinal lining had been punctured repeatedly, and blood had already been leaking internally for hours. One sharp shard had cut into a major abdominal blood vessel, causing severe internal bleeding. And for me, this is so terrifying, even imagining how he drank that shake without noticing anything unusual at all. Doctors attempted emergency transfusions and surgery, but Kyle died during the operation. The investigation afterward revealed what caused the injuries. Examiners recovered the blender from Kyle's sink and discovered that part of the inner glass wall was missing. During blending, the cracked jar had fractured further and released small glass fragments along with a few larger splinters into the thick shake without him noticing. Some pieces were nearly invisible inside the protein mixture. The autopsy confirmed that ingested glass fragments had perforated his digestive tract and damaged a major abdominal blood vessel, causing fatal internal bleeding. 2 weeks later, Kyle's gym held a memorial workout in his honor. According to several members, people went home afterward and immediately started checking every cracked blender, mug, and glass container in their kitchens.
It was August 14th, 2017, along a quiet stretch of shoreline outside Iloilo. The morning catch had already been sorted, and several boats were tied along the edge of the dock. A group of 6 fishermen stayed near a small wooden shed, preparing lunch instead of heading home. Arnel de la Cruz was 38, a dock worker who spent most of his days doing physical labor along the shoreline. He was known for taking on extra shifts, rarely turning down work, and eating whatever was quick and available. That afternoon was no different. He stayed near the dock with a small group of co-workers, passing time between tasks with a simple meal they decided to prepare on site. They had cassava brought in earlier that morning, peeled, chopped, and ready to cook. One of them set up a portable burner just outside a small shed. Another brought sugar. A third arrived carrying a metal container taken from a nearby construction area. It looked usable, thick, wide, intact, with only faint markings left from an old label. When it was opened earlier, it had a faint chemical smell, but it wasn't strong enough to raise concern. No one questioned it further. Water was added, followed by the cassava. The container was placed over the burner, and as it heated, the smell of boiling starch and sugar filled the area, masking any remaining odor. One of them stirred while another tested a small portion. The taste came out slightly bitter, but not enough to stop them. They kept eating until the food was gone. Afterward, nothing felt immediately wrong. A few noticed the aftertaste but stayed where they were, sitting on crates and scattered equipment near the dock. The moment passed like any other break. Quiet, routine, uneventful. About 30 minutes later, Arnel shifted his position and pressed a hand against his abdomen. The discomfort came on quickly and didn't ease. Within minutes, it turned sharp. One of the others began showing the same signs, then another. The group started to move, but their balance was off. The progression was fast. Pain turned into nausea, then dizziness. One man vomited near the edge of the dock. Another dropped to one knee, unable to stay upright. The area became unsteady as more of them were affected at the same time. Arnel tried to step away from the group but stopped after a few steps. He bent forward as the vomiting continued. During one episode, material entered his airway. He coughed once, but it wasn't enough. Within the next few moments, his breathing became shallow and irregular. Soon after, he lost stability and collapsed onto the sand. The others called for help immediately. Nearby residents responded, and emergency services were contacted. By the time responders arrived, multiple individuals were in visible distress. Arnel was already unresponsive. Paramedics began airway management and transported all 6 men to the hospital. 5 stabilized. Arnel did not. The investigation later traced everything back to the container they used to cook the cassava. It had previously been used to store an industrial alkaline degreasing compound designed for cleaning engine parts. Residue remained along the inner surface. When the container was heated, those chemicals transferred into the food. The bitterness they noticed was the only warning. Medical findings confirmed that the contaminated cassava caused acute gastrointestinal distress, triggering repeated vomiting. During one of those episodes, Arnel aspirated, leading to oxygen deprivation. The cause of death was ruled as asphyxia due to aspiration, with chemical ingestion as a contributing factor. It was April 22, 2018, in New Orleans, Louisiana. The evening air was warm and humid as the French Quarter buzzed with tourists and locals moving through its narrow streets, lined with historic buildings and wrought iron balconies. Trevin Hales, a 24-year-old hospitality trainee, had recently moved to New Orleans after graduating from a hospitality management program earlier that year. The job was his first real position in the industry, and the long shifts managing the busy nightlife district were both exciting and exhausting. Like many newcomers to the city, he spent his free time exploring local restaurants and documenting his experiences on social media. That evening, after finishing work, Trevin stopped at a well-known seafood restaurant in the French Quarter, famous for its fresh Gulf Coast oysters. Despite living in a coastal city for several months, he had never actually tried raw oysters before. He set his phone on the table and began recording as trays of raw oysters arrived on crushed ice. The video showed him eating the oysters one after another while counting them aloud. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with the dinner crowd, while staff at a nearby counter worked quickly shucking oysters to keep up with orders. By the time he reached the midpoint of the platter, around his 20th oyster, the empty shells had begun piling up beside the tray within view of the camera. In the recording, he briefly turned the phone toward the growing stack while continuing to count. As he lifted another oyster from the tray, the video shows him pausing briefly and adjusting it in the shell before swallowing it. Moments later, he continued eating as the count toward 40 went on. The pace of the meal left little time to inspect each oyster carefully. At some point during the meal, a small, jagged fragment of oyster shell embedded in one of the oysters was swallowed unnoticed. The rest of the evening passed without immediate concern. By the following day, Trevin began experiencing severe abdominal pain that continued to worsen throughout the afternoon. Weakness and fever followed as his condition deteriorated. When he failed to report for work that evening, co-workers attempted to reach him without success. Later that night, Trevin collapsed inside his apartment. Emergency responders transported him to a nearby medical facility, where doctors quickly recognized signs of a serious abdominal infection. Emergency surgery was performed in an attempt to identify the source of the internal damage. Despite aggressive medical treatment, Trevin died from septic shock. Because the illness followed a meal of raw oysters, physicians initially considered a bacterial infection commonly associated with Gulf Coast seafood. During surgery and the subsequent medical examination, doctors discovered a sharp fragment of oyster shell lodged near a perforation in the wall of his small intestine. The puncture had allowed bacteria from the digestive tract to enter the abdominal cavity, triggering the severe infection that spread through his body. The official report concluded that the fatal infection began with an intestinal perforation caused by the ingested oyster shell fragment during the meal. Local health authorities later reviewed the restaurant's seafood handling procedures. No violations were reported, and the incident was ultimately classified as an accidental ingestion.